Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see you. Glad it's reciprocated. I hope you all have had a great Sunday morning so far. If we haven't met, my name is Pete. I am the youth pastor here. And my team, Olivia and I, and our adult relational leaders, our job is basically to look over the middle school and high school students. And as Olivia mentioned, house parties coming up, summer's here. Some of you are bearing your bare knees for the shorts, so I commend you for that. I'm not allowed to. But I'm excited for summer, but I'm also nervous because as a youth pastor, if we go on trips and kids act out, kids don't get in trouble. The adult kid gets in trouble. And so you can imagine, before we leave for a trip, I always get them together, I gather them up, and give them the agenda, give the speech, the rules, the expectations, the do's, the don'ts, and I always end with what is the number one rule. Now, it's fitting that I have a few high schoolers sitting in the front row, so would any of you like to tell me what the number one rule is? Margaret?
Don't be an idiot.
Huh?
Don't be an idiot.
Don't be an idiot. So the number one rule is don't be an idiot. I've said this here before, but if you don't know, scripturally, it covers a multitude of sins. And if any student gets too out of hand, I typically remind them of rule number 2, which is don't make Pete remind you of rule number 1. I had two big brothers, and I know how to be any kind that I need to be pending the current situation. It's a beautiful thing to hear a student say, don't be an idiot, because in their mind, you know something is working. But it will fascinate you how quickly that goes away at their first taste of freedom, whether they're running shirtless across a campus and you're with the other adults and you get to be like, they're with me. Yeah, it's happened far too often. But it's just that when high schoolers and middle schoolers, when they're with friends, they have no shame. They are invincible of both harm and rationale. Parents, I'm sure you can attest to that. However, what I do appreciate with my job is seeing them progress and grow and mature in age, hopefully, because ultimately decisions do have consequences and regret does become a real thing in time. And that reminds me of a time in college when I had friends who didn't really understand that truth until one beautiful dark night. Now, when I was a sophomore in college, I had a teammate who was turning 21, and I was already in bed. It was 12:30. They were pulling my covers. Pete, come on, we're gonna go, just have a drink, celebrate. We're gonna honor him. They just kept using that phrase. We're gonna honor him, celebrate his big night. You know, just a couple Christian high school kids who never had a rebellious bone in the body, testing the waters. And so I say, you know what? I have an exam in the morning. I can't be bothered. Tell me about it later. I wake up in the morning, and I ask them, how'd it go? They say, you wouldn't believe us if we told you. I'm intrigued. What happened? Apparently, they were in an abandoned parking lot around 1:30, 4 of them with a six-pack, rager. And so they're there, the car's off, music is just like on their, like no disturbance, nothing crazy. They literally just like, freedom. Like, it's, again, I know students with a taste of freedom, so it reminds me of my old days. And so apparently they're there around 1:30, nothing's happening until a car, I went to Johnson City, Tennessee. Anyone? Tennessee? It exists. But we were down there, and the hills of Johnson City, Tennessee, a car rides by. And they're like, that's weird. It's late in the morning. No one usually drives by. Car comes back, stops at the top, slowly makes its way down the abandoned parking lot, and there they see the amazing flashing blue and red lights. And fear fills their chest and something else fills their pants. And the cops get out of their car, they walk their way over and they say, all right, guys, hand over your IDs. And they notice that all but one of them, so all 3 of them but one, is underage. They give them the look, and the 2 cops walk back to their cop car, and the cops know exactly what they're doing. They're 100% letting fear just eat these boys up. And so they're talking amongst their cars. They're even like raising their voice, going back and forth what they should do. And my friends, I kid you not, are shivering by their car. I'm gonna get expelled. There goes my scholarship. I'm gonna have to change my name. My mom's gonna disown me. And the cops are watching this and they're just eating it up. So after about 10 minutes, the cops come back to my friends, hand their IDs in, and the short cop looks at them and says, all right, guys, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Easy way is that you get in our car, we take you to the station, and you call your parents to let them know what you've been up to this hour of the night, the type of foolishness that you've been up to. And then the other cop, the tall, long, lurch, Gumby-looking like fellow like me, he says, or You could do it the hard way. He takes his phone, he goes to the car, plugs it into the aux, turns on Teach Me How to Dougie. He says, or you can dance for a minute, like the fools that you are. So my friends in an abandoned parking lot in Johnson City, Tennessee, at 2 a.m., danced like absolute fools, and fear has never left them since. They danced both to embarrassment and to freedom. And again, the police officers obviously saw they were in no real danger. They just wanted to scare them a little bit. And apparently as they left, the one shorter cop, before she put her head in the car, she said, guys, if I could just give you one piece of advice, live by one simple rule. What do you think the rule is? Don't be an idiot. I heard you say that like you were saying that at me. I'm listening, I hear you, I see you. And it's funny now, but my friends, they truly were traumatized for a bit thinking about what could have happened, likely because I was a terrible friend and never let them forget it. And I know last week, Brian made you relive The Lion King. I'm not gonna make you sing Hakuna Matata. Some of you are still recovering from that. But the next morning when I heard about this is when I recited the philosophical phrase of one of the greatest Disney movies ever, if you look at this picture, where I looked at him and I said, dishonor on you, on your cow, on your mom. Okay, guess I didn't land. But because I wanted to honor, I'm not going to say names, Brian. For anyone who missed last week, we're in the beginning of a brand new series entitled Not What I Was Made For. And to be very blunt, it's exactly what we're talking about. One of the most influential people of my life ever, he baptized me at 21. His name was David Sanford. And he said, it's important to know who you are. It's vital to know who you're not. And that's what we're going to dig into a little bit this series. Not just knowing who you are, but physically responding according to when you experience something that you're not. So if you missed last week or you need a recap, something that Brian talked us through were these slides. And I'm gonna go through them fairly quickly to set up today, okay? The first slide is we notice inevitably sometimes in our life that something is wrong. We notice that something's wrong. We can directly correlate this to a wound in our past, and ultimately that wound changes how we see ourselves. We've realized that it's shaped around the way we see ourselves. The good news is that either through people, through friends, through church, we do hear about and or meet Jesus. We hear that he gives us this new identity, which is exciting. However, we are still operating under the old identity because of the hardwiring and the habits of the previous years of experience and mental approaches to life. Now, growing up, this happens subconsciously. I remember I always struggled in math. Anybody in here struggle with math where like these are your calculators, even today? Yeah. So I remember I was struggling in math. My parents got me a tutor. And after a couple weeks, one of the topics that I had been struggling with finally made sense. So the tutor, in her wisdom, decided to teach me ahead of time what I would be learning the following week. And I was fascinated that this thing actually comprehended it. Now, I want to say this may date me, the FOIL method. Yeah, first outside, inside, last parentheses. The South is weird. I could be wrong. I don't know what they teach me versus you. So long story short, I genuinely understood the next cycle of learning and the approach to it. So the following week in class, my teacher said, all right, class, we're going to learn this new approach to this type of problem. And internally, I'm so excited. I'm propping myself up in my chair. I'm getting my notes ready, and I'm ready to basically show off what I know. And I'm excited because I'm recognizing everything that she's explaining, everything she's writing on the board. It's making sense until she messes up. She makes a mistake and she does something out of order. And she doesn't realize that she is going to derail these fourth graders' future college careers if I don't do something about this. So I raised my hand, which never happened in math class, and I said, Miss, I wasn't that kid. I said her name. I said, Miss, that's not correct. She asked what I meant, and I went up and I grabbed a piece of chalk. For those of you who don't know, a chalkboard. It's a torturous device for students in every capacity. But I go up there and I have an honest Goodwill Hunting moment to where I write up the perfect response, and she says the best 3 words any student could ever hear: you are correct. I say, I know. I literally spin around, I make my way back to my seat, and in doing so, I make sure to make eye contact with Madison. Because Madison needs to know what her husband in 4th grade did so she can tell our kids about it. And as I make eye contact, I trip over my feet and my knee drives full force into the projected corner by the door, splitting it in half, blood everywhere. In my immediate high of mental brilliance, which again was very new to me, was met with incredible embarrassment. And I made sure to laugh it off though. And I laughed everything off for the next 8 years of high school, even into college, and even some today. I deeply remember, it's weird thinking about like, not wounds, but foundational moments. I remember always feeling like academically, I just was not there as many as other people. I remember always feeling behind in class. Don't tell Brian this, he's not here. I never took an AP class in high school. Some of you are like, I see it. But I did get best sense of humor as a superlative in a very tiny class, which I now see is directly correlated to how I wanted to cover up the feeling of inadequacy and not being up to everyone else's standards. So even today at times, if I mess up, if I make a mistake, there is that small voice in my head that says, makes sense, or it was only a matter of time. And that's why I always preface things with, I could be wrong, because I believe there's a high probability that I am. Last week, Brian talked about wounds and how that can mold the way that we see ourselves. So my feelings of inadequacy or inability both live under the umbrella of what it is that we're addressing today. So stay in your seats. It's going to get exciting because we are talking about shame. A little dramatic effect there. I like it. Okay. No, but seriously, we're talking about shame, and I think regardless of however you're processing this now, I think you're going to be happy that you're here this Sunday. I want to start off by making sure there's a stark difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is I did something bad, whereas shame is I am bad. Similar to my story with math, I made a mistake, so I am a mistake maker, no questions about it. While guilt is an acknowledgement of an action, shame internalizes that action, latches onto our identity, and influences every aspect of how we see ourselves. Brian asked us last week a very open question: do you want to be free? And shame, unfortunately, is the most associated norm for addictions, depression, violence, aggression, suicide, eating disorders, you name it. So if you have or are experiencing shame, today is for you. If you know someone who fits that list, you could be the disciple that helps bring them out of the dark and into the light of what they were made for. Now, finally, there are a few things I need to say to preface today's message about such a topic, and that is that when it comes to forms of shame that we may experience, or the wounds that Brian mentioned last week, whether it's self-inflicted and it's a habit that you've done or you do and you regret it, maybe it's something that you don't feel like you have control of and it's confusing, or if you have shame for something that someone else did to you, I want you to know Jesus came for all of those. What he did on the cross was for you, and you were not made to carry the shame that you unfortunately have been carrying. Lastly, if your shame is tied to that last part, where it's tied to something that someone else did to you, two things. One, I'm so sorry. Genuinely. I'm sure it's heavy, I'm sure it's real, and it's likely the way and the reason that you see yourself. But two, please hear my heart behind this. Your healing within that cannot be dependent on someone else's understanding of your pain. That will submit you to an endless cycle of frustration and blame. You may not be responsible for what happened to you, but I do believe you are positioned and therefore empowered to, in your own timing, begin your path to healing. And I strongly believe that what we're going to talk about today, what we look at in the Bible, can lead us out of shame and into the new creation that God is calling us towards. And it may surprise you, but shame is actually one of the very first emotions ever mentioned in the Bible. Genesis 2:24-25, it says, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother, is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame." So from the get-go, before sin entered the world, God wanted you to know shame was never meant to be a factor. I remember when I first started here, my boss took me to a youth ministry conference, and I was still getting used to this idea of youth ministry. And they were doing this dumb responses game where they had all these different volunteers from different churches on stage, and they had the big screens, and they would put up a word, and you had to, without thinking about it, respond. How do you act? How do you respond to those words? And there were phrases like riding a roller coaster, opening up a present on Christmas morning, playing hopscotch, and then all of a sudden, this 5-letter word, naked, appeared on the screen. And you can imagine everyone just like immediately covers up. Some of them dropped to the floor. Some of them tried to hide, except for this one veteran volunteer. He must have been like 65. He literally just looked around, walked up to the front, and Superman stanced it. I guess he had no shame to hide, but I also don't know how long he volunteered after that. I don't know what that would have been. But it is important. It is vital for us to know. Before sin entered the world, when it was just God and humankind, shame was never meant to be a factor. So for you to hear it and see it, I need you to understand the first point. You were not made for shame. You were not made for shame. And that sounds nice, sounds like something I'm supposed to say, but the reality is because of the world we live in, because of how different we all are, we will carry our own shame in our own way. And that's why I appreciate that so many people in the Bible actually experience shame. And what we need to see more than anything is their response to it. So what I want to do today, very simple. I want to talk you through just a couple people, give you an idea of what they went through, show you how they responded, and then be very upfront. I'm going to ask you to consider doing the same. So first up to the plate, we have Moses, okay? One of the songs we sang earlier talked a little bit about Moses. And here's the Cliff Note version. I'm going to do my best. Stick with me. You'll see the big picture. It's going to be okay. Moses was a Hebrew baby raised in an Egyptian palace. Already some shame for who he is and who he's not. And one day he sees an Egyptian beating one of his own, a Hebrew, so Moses kills that Egyptian. Moses gets caught. Pharaoh tries to kill him for it, so Moses hides out of fear and shame. Moses runs out of shame and fear. Do you remember what Adam did when he sinned in the garden? The first thing he did, he hid. Recognize, shame will always separate you mentally before it ever separates you spiritually. And Moses was trying to separate himself as much as possible from his past until one day, many years later. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the story. Moses is away from the Egyptians in the desert, not even seeking God. He's doing his own thing, and he encounters the burning bush. Now, in this burning bush, this is AI's depiction of it, so kind of accurate. In the burning bush, God is speaking to Moses, and God says the scariest thing, which is, I want you to go back to your past, back to your home, back ultimately to your source of shame. And through the perspective of shame, we can see how and why Moses responds the way that he does. So after God says Moses is going back, he responds 3 times. Moses does. 3, verse 11, he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? God says, I'll be with you. 3:13, Moses says, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what's his name? What shall I tell him? This is when God gives the famous I am that I am statement. And for the next 7 verses, God is verbally reassuring Moses, I'm with you. I'll tell you what to say. You're going to be fine. You're going to be good. Chapter 4, verse 1, Moses says, but what if they don't believe me or listen to me and say the Lord did not appear to you? God is realizing, okay, speaking to this needy boy isn't helping that much. So I need to show him. So God does 2 miracles. Moses is holding a staff. He says, I want you to throw the staff on the floor. And as soon as he does, it becomes a snake. God says, grab it by its tail, turn back into a staff, 1 miracle. Second miracle, God says, I want you to stick your hand inside your cloak, take it out, it becomes all leprous. Put it back in the cloak, take it out, you do the hokey pokey, and you take it out. When he took it out, it was completely fine. So Moses is physically, tangibly seeing 2 real miracles. And I want to pause and say, how often have we all prayed, God, if you just show yourself to be true, I will do this. Moses saw 2 very physical, tangible miracles, still had questions, still had doubts, still had shame. After those 2, verse 8, God says, if they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, maybe they'll believe the second. But if they don't believe these 2 signs, take some water from the Nile, pour it on the ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. 3 different things, the staff, the hand, and just in case in the future, the Nile. Moses pushes back one more time about not being able to speak eloquently. And God has had it at this point. So verse 11, the Lord said to him, who gave human beings their mouth? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not me? Now go, I will help you speak and teach you what to say. And finally, you think after all of this, Moses is reassured, he's encouraged, he's confident, and he's ready to go, right? Verse 13, Moses says, pardon your servant, Lord. Just please send someone else. And I want us to see that shame will do this. Shame will have us needing God to be everything he says he is, but deny any opportunity to actually experience him. Typically under the mask of imposter syndrome. What I do love about Moses is that ultimately he does go on to be the person that God saw him as the leader who had a voice despite the shame that told him different. And Moses learned to trust over time, and we can learn. And I want to tell you, this is so foundational, but I think so much of us could be potentially buried in shame that we forget it. The main point is that it is okay to need God. It is okay to need God. We have some resilient, strong, stubborn as heck minds in this room. It is okay to need God. And the day that you don't is the day that you believe you've actually become one. It is okay to need God. Maybe in your shame, that's all you need to know, that you need God, because you were not made to do this on your own. And one man who thought he could do a lot on his own was the next person I want to talk about, and that's David. Okay? Now, David in the Old Testament, the youngest of 8 boys, bless the mom. One day, God sent a prophet to anoint David to tell him, in the years to come down the road, you will be the next king. I don't care how old you are or how humble you are, that will give you one heck of an ego boost, all right? So David is growing up knowing this knowledge that in years, people will bow down to me. People will serve me. Ego boost. David goes on knowing this, kills a giant, literally Goliath, ego boost. Goes on for people to love him, ego boost. Goes on to become king, ego boost. Becomes known as the man after God's own heart. What can't David do? Ego boost. Until he reminds everybody that he's human. We know the story. 2 Samuel 11, one evening David got up from his bed, walked around on the roof of the palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Yes, you read that right. The one with the relationship with God screwed up. Hopefully perfection can be released from our minds a little bit. I'd like to remind everybody this is why the Bible is relatable. It is not filled with righteous saints who live a perfect life. It is a collection of jacked up people who screw up royally, more so than most of us ever will. But more than that, they're honest about their emotions with God. Now, David goes on to continue his stupidity streak. He kills the husband, has a baby with Bathsheba, and ultimately he was caught. He was confronted by a guy named Nathan. And shame sets in, as you can imagine. If you've ever been called out red-handed, face-to-face, nowhere to hide, all your stuff is there, super fun. Shame just sets in, and you can imagine David in this spot. But in that spot, I need you to switch places with him. And I have to ask you, how would you respond if you were David? You cannot deny what is so obvious that you've done. How would you respond? Where would you hide? What would your first thought be? It's imperative that we ask these questions so that we can see the relevance that the Bible has in our lives. Because David would go on to write over 70 Psalms for us. And what I want to do is I want to show you one of the ones that they believe David wrote after his interaction of being confronted. So after he's faced with his shame, faced with his sin, faced with the reality that I'm not going to get away with this, one of the first things David writes down is Psalm 32. Okay? It says this: when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Sounds like guilt, sounds like shame, and it sounds real. Look at verse 5. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave me of the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. Surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. Lastly, verse 7, you are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. In his regret, in his embarrassment, in his shame, when he feels the furthest from everything that he was told he would be, and when the easiest thing to do would be to believe that God doesn't see him as that anymore, yes, David confesses his sin, but he also acknowledges that God never left him. And I want us to be aware that's a different level of awareness when it comes to faith. For us to not just separate ourselves and to pull out because we have made a mistake like Adam and Moses did. So we have two realities of responding to shame. One reality of responding to shame is like Moses just saying, God, I need you. And then actually letting him be God. Another reality we have is like David, being honest, knowing that you have God, and verbally admitting and acknowledging that he doesn't leave you even when you do mess up. This can be the hardest thing for me to process sometimes, but I remember these stories, I read them, and then I have to ask myself a question. I want to ask it to you as well. What if you were able to shape your shame to always see God through it? What if you were able to shape your shame to see God through it? You may be in a spot where you feel like you desperately need God more than anything. You may feel like you've never had a relationship with God or even deserved one because of the shame that you carry. But what I really want to show you is Jesus' response to the concept of shame. This happens in John 9. It's a very quick story, but I love it because he says so much by saying so little. John 9, 1-2, it says this: As he went along, Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And you can see what the disciples are asking. Who's to blame here? Who owns the shame in this situation? Jesus responds by saying, verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We can see that Jesus did not play the blame game. Rather, he showed us a very real point that today's message can entirely be summed up in this phrase. Your response to shame shapes your relationship with God. Your response to shame shapes your relationship with God. And I want to clarify, the way that you shape shame shapes your relationship with God because it will position you for what you feel you believe you deserve versus what you were actually made for. The blind man probably felt shame just for being different. And for some reason, God was punishing him. But Jesus said it doesn't have anything to do with those assumptions. So even though the perspective was shame, the position was God's glory. So if we can learn to shape any shame we feel for an opportunity to experience God's glory or grace through it, then we can finally experience what we were made for and not identify ourselves by something that we can't control. What if that's freedom? What if that's what you were made for? Because the truth is, whatever you walked in through those doors this morning, whatever you did this morning, whatever you've been holding, whatever baggage you've had all week, I'm here to tell you God is not mad at you. He's mad about you. He's arguably crazy, willing to die and rise for you. He loves you more than you could ever know. And what hurts the most is that shame will keep you from believing any facet of that because you know you too well. But we don't take time to understand that our Maker knows us better. No one understood that better than Paul, the killer and persecutor of Christians. Until Moses and David, God helped Paul reposition the shame of his past to see what he was truly made for. And if you have time this week, you should read Acts 9 to see his conversion and to understand what actually happened in his life. Now, Paul, he had a past. He had a crazy history. But he ends up, like David, writing about a quarter of the New Testament in the Bible, sending letters to churches and encouraging them in certain things. And do you remember last week, Brian talked about a 2-word phrase? He said it over and over and over again about this new life and new creation. It was, what was the phrase? In Christ. I will tell Brian you didn't answer. In Christ. What I love is that Paul used that phrase over 140 times in the New Testament. If you think Moses and David were bad, Paul was a different beast. And his shame could and arguably should have been a monster. Paul could have let shame shape his future, his purpose, and his perspective. But he decided to let God's grace be bigger because he understood something that could only be understood after the resurrection. Now, I know Easter was 2 weeks ago. We've kind of settled back into our reality. There's way less pastels in here, which I appreciate. But I want us to relive the truth of something. I think we throw around the phrase, Jesus paid our debt. We throw that around without taking time to realize what that means. When Jesus paid for your past, I am sorry to inform you, but that means that you legally have zero rights to your past. You have zero ownership for any day before right now. And any shame associated with that, you may feel it and it may be real, but it's also a real responsibility for you to hand that over to Jesus if you believe that is what he paid for. The old is gone, the new has come. That is freedom. You see, shame almost shaped Paul, but there was one vision that he had that allowed him to see past that. Now, my brother showed me this verse when I was 15, and it's been one of my favorites, and it makes so much sense as the culmination of today's message. It's Ephesians 3. Now, I want you to look at the screen. Paul says, and I pray that you, being rooted and established, not in shame, not in regret, not in your past, not in your mistakes, not in your mess ups, rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. So love that surpasses knowledge, it means you have to experience it to understand it. And for you to experience freedom, you need to shape your shame for God to show you who he is and who he created you to be. So in summary, Moses needed God. David had God. Paul accepted he was loved by God. These are three different responses that I believe mimic the three truths that need to be received in this room today. Now, like I said, Brian's not here, so no rules. I'm going to switch things up, and I'm actually going to ask all of you to physically stand if you would. As the moaning happens and the bones are aching and creaking with your joints, I want to let you know this is how we're going to pray out today's service. This series is not about thinking your way through shame. It's not about thinking your way to a better, happier place. It's about physically responding against the things you were not made for so you can experience the freedom that you were made for. Now, the very, very last song that we sang, the Lord, I Need You tag, we're going to sing that twice. But what I want to happen is I want, whether you're in shame, whether you're holding it, or whether you just need to say it, something that you haven't said in a long time. For some of you, this may be the first time you've ever verbalized that you need God. So I'd like for everyone's hands to just kind of be open like this. Best way to give a present, same way to receive one. Band's gonna sing, Lord, I Need You twice. And I want you to let this be between you and God. How do you need him in your shame? How do you need him in your day-to-day? Let this be the chance, maybe for the first time, that you get to verbalize that. We'll sing it twice, and I'll tell you what's next.
Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Oh Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you.
Now, I don't know who needs this next one specifically, but for anyone in this room who feels like God has left you because of what you've done or what's been done to you, it's a solid truth to know that you need God, but it's a powerful truth to know that he has never left you and that you do have him. You have God. You have access to him, so we're going to sing that once.
Lord, I have you. Oh, I have you. 'Cause every hour I have you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I have you.
Moses needed God. David had God. It took some time, but Paul was able to receive the truth that he was loved by God. That can be, for some of us, one of the hardest truths to believe, accept, or receive. But let us remember, it is John 3:16, for God so loved the world, not the perfect people. It doesn't say for God so loved the Christians. He loved the world. He loves you. God doesn't love you because Jesus died for you. Jesus died for you because God loves you. Now this next part, it's not self-idolatry, it's not self-worship. It is God's greatest message that he wants you to receive in your heart, to believe and receive the fact that you are worth being loved. So we're going to sing, Lord, you love me. We're going to sing it twice. And may you receive the greatest truth you were ever made to know.
So Lord, you love me, oh, you love me. Every hour you love me, 'cause you're my one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how you love me. Yeah, Lord, you love me. Oh, you love me. In every hour you love me. You're my one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how you love me.
We pray this in Jesus' name.